there any relevance of native speaker norms? That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric? From feedback to learner autonomy, we'll discuss it all on TEFLology.
Welcome back to the TEFLology Podcast, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters. In this episode, we bring you an interview with Dr. Christina Gkonou. Christina is a senior lecturer in the Department of Language and Linguistics at the University of Essex in England. Her research interests include psychology of foreign language learning and teaching, language teacher agency and identity, and language teacher and learner emotions, which is the topic of this interview. Christina's published works include the 2017 book, New Insights into Language Anxiety, Theory, Research, and Educational Implications, written with Mark Daubney and Jean-Marc Dewale, and the paper, Understanding Emotional and Social Intelligence Among English Language Teachers, written with Sarah Mercer. Matt spoke to Christina in June 2018 during her trip to Japan, where she was a plenary speaker at the JALT Teacher Development SIG's Teacher Journeys Conference. We hope you enjoy the interview.
So as we begin with all of our interviews, and we're currently at this conference titled Teacher Journeys, so in the spirit of things, could you briefly tell us your journey in our field?
Yes, so first of all, thank you for asking me to do this interview.
You're welcome.
And I look forward to discussing different topics related to emotions with you. So how everything started with me. I think I was an anxious learner myself, and I was a good student. But at the same time, I was feeling nervous every time that I would have to say something in class, either by volunteering or by being asked by the teacher to answer a question. And that was not the case just in the English language class or in the foreign language classes, but it was the case in all subjects, in all school subjects. So when I had the chance to do research, through the PhD, the MA first and then the PhD, I decided to focus on this topic and read a little bit more about it, see what other people think about it and how other learners feel about anxiety, and this is how it all started.
Right. I
see.
Yeah, that's something interesting you said there. Like, as a learner, I don't like being picked on in class to read out something. So I've started to now think about me as a teacher, and should I be picking out on my learners to read stuff, and just thinking about that relation between the two. So I guess that was the kind of thing that kind of motivated you.
Yes, and I think if you have the chance to do both, most of us, those people that are teachers, have been learners at some point. And we have the chance to see things from both perspectives. And that's very important, because when you then become a teacher, you start thinking, oh, should I do this? Should I name students and ask them to answer a question and so on? Some teachers have to do it, though, especially if they're evaluating the students. And this is something we can't avoid. But the two are definitely linked, and they were the main reasons why I wanted to work on this area.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So moving on to what we're going to talk about today, emotions. Firstly, how is the study of emotions kind of positioned within the field of SLA with regards to kind of other disciplines or other areas of research, I guess?
Right, so more and more people are investigating emotions. There's a lot of interest in a number of learner emotions, such as language learner anxiety. But recently there is a lot of interest in teacher emotions, which are generally viewed as a whole. People tend to look at them holistically rather than saying, okay, in my project I will focus on this particular emotion. So probably this all comes from the realization that they work together. They all work in tandem, so we can't really see them individually. But at the same time, in general education, and I hope this is something that we will not do in language education, emotions are still viewed as soft skills. Things that people can find out very easily because they are there in everyday life as well, not just at work or while we are studying, and therefore we can deal with them much more easily, much quicker than other kinds of skills. And by other kinds of skills, I mean those skills that we need explicit teaching or explicit instruction for, which are considered more difficult. But I am kind of against this distinction, and because I still think that emotional skills can be taught and they should be taught. So we'll expand on it later.
Yeah, okay. So I guess the first place to start would be the learner. And I thought I'd split our interview into two halves. First exploring emotions related to our language learners, and then emotions with regard to the language teacher. And I think along the way we'll see that these are perhaps closely related with one another. So to begin, a language learning classroom may be fundamentally different to other types of learning environments, given the interactive nature of what's going on. In general, what emotions have studies found learners to feel?
Okay, anxiety has been the most widely researched emotion in that case, language learner anxiety in particular. And there have been studies recently that are looking at the links between anxiety and enjoyment. So a rather negative emotion and a positive emotion. And many of the studies have also looked at affect as a group of emotions, which also includes motivation.
Right.
So affect includes emotions, and it includes motivation and attitudes as well. So motivation and attitudes are not really emotions, but they are closely linked with emotions.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what can emotions tell us? Like, by researching our learners' emotions, what can they tell us about the learning experience or the learning environment?
That it is very complex, actually, that our learners, and the same goes for teachers, experience a large number of emotions, and this change a number of times during the lesson, and that also these emotions influence their identities in the classroom, and they also influence their performance as well.
Yeah.
So we mentioned earlier this distinction between cognition, in the presentation this morning, the distinction between cognition and emotion, and that in early research into individual differences, people tended to think that a weak learner or an unsuccessful learner is not an intelligent learner, or has no aptitude for language learning, for instance.
Yeah.
But people have moved away from this kind of research paradigm, and they are now looking at other factors which are outside of this cognitive domain, and they focus more on the affective domain or the emotion-related domain in that case.
Yeah.
So emotions have a role to play in who our students are, and how they show this identity and how well they do as well.
And I guess this move away from the cognitive domain, this is kind of reflective of the social turn.
Yes,
I
the
guess,
social turn,
which
definitely.
is kind of going on still, I guess. It's still being talked about. How do emotions and looking at things within the social turn, how do they relate, perhaps?
Right, yeah, I will answer this question, and something to add to the previous one was this introduction of EQ as opposed to IQ. So IQ was what people used to study in the past, and of course it's a very important construct, one's intelligence, but people have started to talk about EQ as the emotional intelligence or the emotion quotient, and that this can be equally important or even more important. And so it is related to it in the sense that emotions are not just subjective and individual or personal, but they are also linked to what is taking place outside of each individual student or each individual teacher.
Yeah.
So there is influence from what is taking place in class as a little social group, and also what is taking place outside of class in our learners' family environments, work environments if we are working with adults, in the study groups, classrooms, and so on. So the social element is there.
Yeah.
And it is also linked with the social character of language learning, or the social nature of language learning. So we are looking at the interactions that take place in class and the communication, which has a very strong social element into it.
Right,
Yeah.
I see. In terms of what studies have found about learner emotions, can you give some examples of particular emotions that have been addressed or have been revealed through studies in this field?
Right. So we can start with anxiety, which has probably attracted the interest of the majority of researchers. And the researchers have found that anxiety is mainly negative, so it influences a learner's performance and achievement in a negative way.
Okay.
And they have also suggested that some anxiety can be positive, like small amounts of anxiety could encourage learners to work harder. And by small amounts, we mean what learners could describe as a tension, so they feel a little bit nervous about what's coming up because it is important for them, for example, or because they have a deadline to meet, and in order to meet the deadline and do well, they are working more. So in that case, they are experiencing some anxiety, but it is positive or facilitating anxiety.
Yeah, I saw in the introduction to your edited book, New Insights into Language Anxiety, the two words facilitating and debilitating anxiety. Yeah. So I thought that was a really nice way to think about the types of anxiety.
Yeah. And some language anxiety researchers are very adamant that there is no such thing as facilitating anxiety. And and they are right, actually, because when the term facilitating anxiety was initially introduced, it was misinterpreted by other researchers and by teachers and by teacher trainers to mean that we need to make our students a little bit anxious in order to make them work. But that was not what facilitating anxiety was intended for. Facilitating anxiety means that you need a little bit of this tension, in a way, in order to be productive. So I think that facilitating anxiety is something that exists and helps people, but we need to make sure it is kept to a minimum level and a controllable, manageable level. And other emotions, researchers such as Jean-Marc de Walle and Peter McIntyre have worked together and have looked at the links between foreign language anxiety and foreign language enjoyment. And basically what they have found is that learners can experience both, even in the same class. Or, in one activity they experience anxiety, and right in the next one they experience enjoyment. So they move from the negative to the positive very quickly.
Do you think, I know this isn't very favourable at the moment to talk about learning styles.
Yeah.
And do you think that enjoyment and anxiety has anything to do with the way that learners prefer some activities over others? And I'm not sure if there's any connection between.
There is. I haven't come across any studies that prove that, but I think it makes some sense, doesn't it? That if you are a visual learner and your teacher is using lots of visual input, you will most likely enjoy the class because you can understand it and you can follow. And the same goes if you're an auditory learner, if you like movement, if you're kinesthetic, and so on. So there should be some link there, but I don't think it has ever been researched empirically. So this is my let's say common sense or whatever.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And I guess I was just thinking back then, facilitative anxiety. That kind of relates to language learning gaps. There needs to be some sort of gap to fill when we're communicating, and also they need to be working within their zone of proximal development. So that's kind of where the anxiety should be, I guess, and if used in the right way.
Exactly. So what you have just said is the most important thing, perhaps, that if it is used in the right way, it can be positive for learners. And I have an MA student at the moment who is doing his MA dissertation on facilitating anxiety. And he actually came across research into physical education, which suggests that competitive anxiety for athletes is very important. And it is something that all athletes experience, and it is never negative. So it is always positive because they have to compete. They know they have to compete with other people, and this helps them to train and become better.
How would like emotional intelligence play a part in that? Because I imagine some learners can better deal with anxiety than others. And the same for teachers as well, of course, as we'll probably talk about. So, I wonder how that plays a part on how they deal with that anxiety.
So one aspect of emotional intelligence is emotion management, and another aspect is self-awareness. So those learners that are emotionally intelligent and can manage their emotions effectively are also more emotionally self-aware.
Okay, I see.
So they can understand better when they feel anxious and why they feel anxious, and for this reason, they are probably in a better position to manage their emotions effectively.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So I guess this is a good point to move on to the teacher, perhaps. So you explained that teacher emotions can be seen as being social, personal, relational, intersubjective, and even political. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how emotions are framed and can be explored with regards to the teacher.
Right. So there are different kinds of frameworks, but maybe I should talk about the latest one, the post-structuralist one, which is really where this description of language teacher emotions comes from. That they are subjective, they are also relational, social, political, and historical as well.
Okay.
So the idea in that case is the emotions that we experience are influenced by a number of factors, and not just from us as people or as practitioners or professionals. They are influenced by the people that are around us, and by the people that are important for us, and by the people that we spend time with. And when we are talking about teachers, these are mainly our students, our colleagues and parents, maybe, our students' parents. So what we feel is heavily influenced by them. And that is why they are not just subjective or personal, but they depend on so many other factors. And you've mentioned classroom discipline earlier, and this is really one of the areas in which teachers need to undertake emotion labor. And it's this idea of the emotion labor of classroom discipline. Because sometimes you need to make sure that your class is disciplined and that your students pay attention to the lesson, and you need to do emotion labor at that time. So you might be angry, but you don't want to show it because you are thinking mainly of other people, what impact it will have on other people, for example, our students. And sometimes you might not really be angry, you might be thinking that what the student has said is really funny and you would like to follow it up, but the classroom conditions, the time that you have, the syllabus or whatever, do not allow you to. So you have to be serious in that case and move on to the next lesson. So that is another type of emotion labor.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, so emotional labor is when you kind of you say, for example, you don't show your anger. You somehow armor yourself against showing that anger for the sake of being professional.
Yes,
is that
exactly.
Right. Okay.
Exactly.
And there's a lot of emotional labor related to teaching because I think you said earlier today that teaching is an other-oriented profession, as in we're oriented towards helping others, I guess. Much like nursing, I think was the example you gave. So as a result, being caring is an intrinsic part of our jobs, yet being caring brings with it emotional labor. So is it the case that the more one cares and invests in their learners, the stronger emotions they feel? Is that always the case?
I think it's usually the case, yes. The more you invest, in understanding people, in trying to help them, the more connected you probably feel with them. But this doesn't necessarily come with negative emotions, like that you feel exhausted maybe because you have invested so much. But if they do well, you might experience other kinds of emotions, such as pride, satisfaction that you have contributed towards someone's achievement, understanding or whatever. So there is some emotion labor there, but it is both negative and positive. And this goes back to the post-structuralist idea that emotional labor is often done for the benefit of students and for the teacher's own benefit.
I see.
Yeah.
So it's kind of high risk, high reward, I guess.
Yes.
Or there's like you said this morning, there's victory. There's emotional victory in putting in this kind of investment into the classroom. Yeah,
and we might not see it right at the time that it's happening. When it's happening, we might think, oh, maybe I shouldn't care that much because it is time-consuming, it is emotionally draining, whatever. But after some time just goes by, then you, upon reflection, you probably think that, okay, this is what I should have done. I have approached it in the right way because these are the positive outcomes now. So you might later on realize the positive impact of your emotion labor. Yeah.
I wonder, has there been any studies done into the type of emotions that learners think teachers should experience in their teaching? Because I imagine they'd say one thing and teachers might say the other. And often teachers invest a lot, but the learners don't really see the full emotions behind all of that investment. So I wonder if the learners would talk about a different kind of emotion that they think the teachers should have. Maybe.
Yeah, I think that would be a very interesting study. I haven't come across any with relation to emotions. I have read, different studies that look at both the learner and the teacher perspective on other topics. For example, how literature could be used for language teaching purposes.
I see.
And what students think about that, what teachers think about that. I haven't come across any studies on emotions, but in research topics, generally it is a good idea to look at both perspectives because, as you said, they might diverge, they might converge as well, which is nice, but they might have different views, and it is good to look at both sides because this will improve even further the way teaching is done. Yeah.
And you showed us some data on Friday, actually, and it seemed that the more mature and experienced teachers are, the better they can armour themselves regarding emotions. So I wonder if you could tell us about how different teachers display or suppress emotions over time.
I think it is related to time and experience because it is something that we learn new things about the way we teach and who we are every day. It's like cooking, for instance. Let's say we have a recipe and we give the same recipe to 5 people and ask them to prepare this dish. And it's not that all 5 dishes will be the same. They will be slightly different in taste, right?
Sure,
You can't have all 5 dishes the same. And I think the same goes for teaching. It's something you keep learning, and you give teachers you give them an idea of different strategies that they could use, but it doesn't mean that all teachers will use them exactly the same way and that the outcome for all of them and for all their classes is going to be the same. So it is something that we keep learning and we can improve in, and because of that, the more experiences we get, the better. That doesn't mean that we don't get brilliant, newly qualified teachers. There are many newly qualified teachers that are doing a fantastic job and students like them. And you see that in the students' grades as well, that they have learned and they have improved. But they can, everyone, it's something that everyone can be better at.
Emotions are kind of observed as a soft skill. So something along that point is you talked about some future research that you're hoping to do related to how emotions are discussed on pre-teaching certificate programs. For example, in the UK, the CERT TEFL program in the UK. At this stage, why do you think it is that trainee teachers and trainers don't use emotions more explicitly as a way to understand or develop classroom practice?
I can think of 2 main reasons. The first one is that there is probably no time and no space in these packed teacher training programs. And the second one is this misconception that they can't be taught or learned.
Right.
And I understand that because it is difficult to talk to people about emotions, and it is difficult to teach people emotions. But there should be some way, I haven't yet figured out how, through which they could be part of these programs and they could be practiced by people. There should be some kind of intervention that could be used, and we can check people's understandings of emotions or experiences of emotions before the intervention, then do the intervention and then check the same aspects again and see whether there has been any change. There have been some programs, intervention programs in general education that have done this, especially with relation to emotional and social intelligence. And they have been successful.
Right, okay.
So there should be a way in which this could be part of language education, and in particular language teacher education.
Somebody on Friday again, somebody in the audience said, they used the term, which I wrote down because I really liked it, preparing emotions, and how that we can kind of, when we're planning our lessons or looking ahead to a class, kind of prepare ourselves emotionally for different stages of the lesson. So for me personally, this kind of resonated. I thought that's a good idea, that we can somehow prepare our emotions in advance of the class.
Sure, we can prepare our emotions with relation to specific stages of the lesson, but I also think maybe we do it unconsciously as teachers, but we also prepare our emotions for different groups of learners. Right. So there are some groups of learners, because we know our groups and we know that each group has got its own different kinds of characters in it. So we prepare for that before the class, and we are thinking, these ones, they might not like that because they are like this and that. I will do something different. Or we are thinking, this will work nicely with that group, but I'm not sure if it will work nicely with the other group. Yeah. So it's something that we do. Maybe we do it unconsciously. We don't always realize it, but I think teachers do that. Yeah. And preparing for emotions, it's not, in that case, it doesn't take the form of a formal preparation, sort of, but it's something that we consider before we enter the classroom, and something we probably reflect on at the end of the lesson.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. And just maybe not on a research level so much, but what can teachers do that are emotionally, I guess, responsive in terms of their daily teaching?
Yeah, for our learners, maybe the first point, or the point where we can start from, could be to talk to them and find out about them, find out information about them and how they feel. How different skills or different types of activities might make them feel. Okay. And for teachers, in terms of self-awareness, reflection might be useful. And it has been a big topic in today's conference, Teacher Journeys, because it is a very important part of the journey of the teacher. And in some cases, this kind of reflection is done formally. It is written down, it's constant, it's done at specific intervals, Some other times, it is done unconsciously. And when I'm interviewing teachers, they tell me, when I drive home, I tend to think of what happened in class. Or some others have said, I tend to do all my thinking while I'm at work, but sometimes I can't avoid it and I'm thinking about it at home. It's something that as teachers we usually do. So I guess just be more aware of it, I guess, and try and document it in some way. Is there anything you'd like to sort of say to our listeners about your future work or anything about this topic you'd like to share? Maybe two things. The first one is that we should be honest about our emotions. We talked about emotional labor earlier, and we said that sometimes we need to hide our true emotions because we are bound by feeling rules, by organization rules or whatever. But we need to be honest about emotions. And I think once we understand or once we acknowledge the role that emotions play in learning and teaching, then we will be better able to deal with them. Because if there is a kind of denial that I don't want to talk about my emotions or I don't want to look further into my students' emotions, then we are not doing anything in order to change that or to deal with that. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that I'm working currently on a book with two colleagues of mine, Jean-Marc Duwale and Jim King. And the book is called Language Teaching an Emotional Rollercoaster. And we are talking about teachers' emotions and how they fluctuate. And the other thing is what we mentioned earlier, that I'm hoping to do some research very soon on the role and perceived importance, let's say, of emotions in language teacher education programs. Why they are absent and how we could possibly make them part of the programs.
Right, I see.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll be really looking forward to reading that.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we'll leave it there, but thank you very much for your time, Christine.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed our discussion. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for listening to the interview. We'd also like to say a big thank you to Christina for her time. If you'd like to get in contact with us, please send us an email at TEFLology@gmail.com. If you'd like to follow us on social media, you can do so on Twitter @TEFLology or on Facebook. To listen to all of our previous episodes and to find out more information about the podcast, visit our website, TEFLology-podcast.com. If you like our show, please consider subscribing, rating, or reviewing us via the podcasting platform that you use. Finally, we're delighted to announce that our book, Podcasting and Professional Development, A Guide for English Language Teachers, is now available in paperback. Head to Amazon to order a copy and support the show. Thanks again for listening, and we'll be back again soon.